Robert F. Kennedy Sr. was born on November 20, 1925, 100 years ago this month. To any student of American history and to any American over the age of 65 living in this country in the 1960s, a recitation of Robert Kennedy's biography is really unnecessary. Attorney General of the United States from 1961 to 1964, and U.S. Senator from New York from 1965 to 1968. Bobby Kennedy was a fierce protector and advisor to his brother, the President, John F. Kennedy, and later compassionate champion for human rights and against the war in Vietnam. Incredibly, in the year 1968, Robert Kennedy predicted that within 40 years this country would elect a Black president, something that to almost everyone else seemed unfathomable in 1968, but of course became a reality exactly 40 years later in 2008. I am convinced that Robert Kennedy's assassination in June 1968, in the midst of his campaign for the Democratic nomination for president, altered the course of American history in a number of tragic ways. I still remember being glued to the TV on June 8, 1968, to watch his sad, slow funeral train make its way from New York to Washington, passing millions of people who turned out trackside to pay their respects. Robert Kennedy was also the father of 11 children. To mark the centennial of his birth, we are privileged and fortunate to have with us at WBGO one of his children, Kerry Kennedy, president of the not-for-profit organization Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. Kerry, thank you for your time and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Always great to be with you, Jeh.
So please tell us about the mission of the Robert F. Kennedy Organization for Human Rights. It would appear to me that you are at least one of, if not the only, really custodian of his legacy. And you've created the organization Robert F. Kennedy for Human Rights. Tell us about the mission.
Sure, thank you. So this was started in 1968 by my mother, Ethel Kennedy, John Lewis, many others, to carry forward Daddy's unfinished work on social justice. And it was created to be a flexible organization that would change with the changing times, but be consistent in his values and vision for a more just and peaceful world. Today, we do three things. We hold governments accountable for human rights abuses through advocacy and litigation. And internationally, we have about 45 cases at any given time, and we've never lost a case. All of those cases are strategic litigation, so they're like Brown v. Board for their countries. So we won the first case holding a government accountable for killing a journalist. That was in Colombia about 5 years ago. About 3 years ago, we won the first case holding a government accountable for killing an LGBTQ activist in Honduras. Domestically, we're primarily focused on anti-Black and anti-Brown violence by police forces and on abuses committed by ICE officials against people in detention. So that's one part. Second, of the 100 largest economies today, 70 of them are corporations. So when you and I were kids, it was like 1 or 2. But today it's 70. 5 years ago, it was 50. So as corporations have more and more power over us, we need to hold them accountable for human rights abuses the way we do governments. And we do that through a top-down approach. So we bring together about 250 people who control about $7 trillion in assets managed, just under about 10% of the entire industry worldwide. And we talk to them about the connections between human rights abuses and investment dollars. and how to make those connections stronger. And we get them to put downward pressure on the companies they invest in to be in compliance with human rights norms. And then the third area we work in is training the next generation of human rights defenders. So if you hold the governments accountable and the corporations accountable, it's for naught unless you bring up the next generation. So we have a human rights education program, kindergarten through law school. One part of it is called John Lewis Young Leaders, and one is called Speak Truth to Power. And we work on that as well.
You know, it's interesting about John Lewis. I just recently finished a biography about him and hadn't fully appreciated that after Martin Luther King's assassination, he really did move toward your father.
Very, very, very much so.
As his next champion, so to speak.
Yeah.
You must have known John Lewis well.
I did. You know, he was a founding member. First of all, in the 68 campaign, he worked on organizing the Black communities for Daddy. So, for instance, when Daddy made that famous speech in Indianapolis after Martin Luther King died, it was John Lewis who organized that rally.
Mm-hmm.
And then, this is so amazing, Jay. After Indianapolis, he went to California. And so he was in charge of organizing the Black community, and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta were organizing the Latino community. And in the last week of the campaign, they had sort of done their work. And so John and Cesar started together going door to door asking for people's votes. Can you imagine opening your door and having Cesar Chavez and John Lewis there?
I can't.
Asking you to vote for a candidate. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary.
So that brings to mind something that I reread this morning the speech that your father gave the day after King's assassination about gun violence in America. I don't want you to betray any family secrets, but did he write that all himself, or did he have help?
You know, Daddy's most famous speech is, can we just go back for a second for your listeners who might not remember these days, but so Daddy was campaigning in Indiana, and he got this call that King had been shot. And then the plane landed in Indianapolis, and he was told by Richard Lugar, who was then the mayor, that King had been killed and that there were riots erupting across the country. And Daddy was now 3 hours late to go to this rally that John Lewis had organized in the largest Black neighborhood in Indianapolis. And Lugar himself, who was mayor, had never been to that neighborhood. I mean, imagine. And Lugar said, you can't go there, it's too dangerous, and I won't allow my police to go there. And Daddy called John Lewis, and John Lewis said, absolutely, come. And so Daddy went. And he gave this extraordinary speech in which he said, what we need in the United States is not violence. What we need in the United States is lawlessness. What we need in the United States is love and peace and compassion towards those who still suffer in our country, whether they're white or whether they're Black. And then he canceled all of his campaign appointments except for one. He went to Cleveland, which is the speech you're talking about. Now, in my opinion, that was probably the best speech of his entire life. And he, in that speech, addressed something that's now become popular, but which nobody else was talking about, which was systemic racism. And he said in that speech, there's something worse than violence, than the gun in the night, the shot in the night. And that's the violence of institutions. It's sending a kid to a school without books. It's telling a father that you have to go get a job where there is no job available or job doesn't pay enough money to feed your family. That's what we really need to address. And then he had canceled all his campaign commitments and he flew back to Washington, where we lived, outside Washington in Virginia. And that next day, I was sitting in our TV room. It's our den, which was dominated by an RCA Victor, with 7 of my siblings and my mother. And my father came downstairs and he was wearing a T-shirt and shorts, because the campaign things were canceled. So he was going to play football with us. But we were watching the news from Washington, D.C. and watching the city go up in flames. I mean, just these huge riots and huge flames everywhere and the disorientation and the terror of it. And he turned around, went back upstairs, came back 2 minutes later in the suit and walked out the front door. 15 minutes later, we're all still watching that TV. And there's my father right there in the middle of flames, in the middle of it all, trying to get peace, trying to quell violence. And this image is, to me, just what we need to be saying today. We've got to stop sitting around watching TV and saying this is terrible. We have to run into the flames. Our country is on fire. Our country is on fire with a president who is dismantling the institutions of democracy, who is pulling back a Supreme Court that is destroying the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, with decimating food stamps, with calling into question science and taking away our vaccines. I mean, it's just across the board. And we need to stop sitting at home. We're just being, we're saying we're outraged on TikTok. And organize, change the political process in our country, make our country what it's supposed to be, a place of peace and justice.
So something about your father I've always wondered. I, of course, did not know him, never met him. In books and portrayals of him, while his brother, the president, was alive, and leading up to that, he's characterized and depicted as sort of this fierce, aggressive defender, campaign manager, helping to get his brother elected president in 1960, helping him to be president. And then after President Kennedy was assassinated, your father is depicted more as a compassionate defender of human rights, against the war in Vietnam, against gun violence. Was there some sort of change in him after his brother's assassination, or were the two characterizations totally compatible and consistent in your mind?
Well, I think that there's some truth to that, but it's more subtle than it's made out to be. I think that, first of all, the reputation for ruthlessness came from when Daddy worked in the 1950s. He worked very briefly on the McCarthy Committee. Mm-hmm. So he was painted with the same brush as the rest of that committee, even though he was vehemently trying to stop what they were doing, and eventually really was responsible in many ways for the reports that brought down McCarthy and Roy Cohn. Secondly, because he was such a strong prosecutor against David Schein and Jimmy Hoffa, who were the heads of the Teamsters Union, which were ripping off rank and file Teamsters members. And he was very, very effective as a prosecutor in that case, but that's how he was that's what people saw on TV. So he was kind of scary. But the truth is that Daddy, he was the seventh child. I'm the seventh child. He was the seventh child.
Hmm.
He was much smaller and sort of scrawnier than his brothers. And he always had this sense of compassion and fighting for people who didn't have a voice, who he felt were being bullied. One of his aides, Jeff Greenfield, said, you could wrap up his entire career in the phrase, get your boot off his neck.
Mm.
So, for instance, when Daddy was in law school, in college, he refused to spend the night in the all-white hotels that his Black football teammates were not allowed in. And then he got the rest of the team to do the same thing. So then Harvard had to change its program. He, in law school, he invited the first winner, the Black winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, to UVA, and it was segregated at that time. So he literally desegregated UVA Law School the first time and permanently desegregated as a result. So I think what happened, Jay, is he was always working for his brother. And then when his brother died and was killed, I think he said, to the heck with it. I'm just going to do what I really want, what my heart is telling me to do. And so he focused much more on civil rights, on anti-poverty programs, on issues facing American Indians, farm workers, those who were outcast in our society or were not as powerful as they should have been in our society.
And of course, he visited South Africa during apartheid also.
That's true, 1966.
Not many American politicians were doing that at the time.
No, they certainly were not. But that was a big part of his belief in foreign policy. His father really believed that the way you get to know the world is by visiting it. And so he and his brothers and sisters used to travel a lot, and they saw what was going on, and they really believed that our country would be best served by being by working with the people who wanted democratic change in their countries and who were the majority of their countries and who were struggling. And so that's where the Alliance for Progress was created for Latin America. And that was his belief for all of Africa, which had been under colonial rule and was shuffling off the coils of colonial power. And he thought our country should be with the people and not with the colonialists.
Kerry, tell us something about your father, Robert F. Kennedy, that most people don't know.
He was an amazing father, and he did something when I had 7 brothers and 3 sisters, and there were a lot of battles in my house, as you can imagine. And I remember once as a kid, we had this beautiful magnolia tree, and we had 2 forts up at the top of the magnolia tree, which is a great climbing tree. And so we were playing World War II. And as usual, my brother, who was a little bit older than me and much better shot than I was playing the Americans up the top of the tree. And I was the Germans, and I was supposed to climb up the tree and capture the fort. And he had all these magnolia pods that looked like grenades, and he was pummeling me with them. And anyway, so I got hit one time too many, and I ran into up the hill into the house, of the second floor into my father's office, which we really weren't supposed to go into when the door was closed. And he was on the phone and he hung up the phone and I jumped on his knee, crying. My brother did this to me. And he said, well, you go get your brother and tell him to come here. I was like, the Attorney General of the United States wants to see you. And up comes my brother, and my dad says, Kerry, now, Michael, you be quiet. Kerry, you tell me what happened. And I told him the whole sad, horrible tale of my victimization. And then he said, now, Kerry, you be quiet. And Michael, you tell me what happened. And that was very irritating and hard to do. And Michael told him, and then I realized that I wasn't all right. And I wasn't only the victim. I was also the perpetrator. And then we had to kiss and make up and go to our rooms and read for an hour. And I think that the lesson he had for us children at home was the lesson he had for our country, that we're not victims, that we need to be we need to take responsibility for our piece in the puzzle of our community, that peace doesn't happen just because you pray for it, although praying is good, but we have to be peacemakers. We have to find the peace. And then you need to read, be informed. And that's what we need to do as a country. And that's what we need to do as children. It was a very great but patient way to resolve conflict.
Your father had in my judgment, uncommon appeal to both working class white and black, working class poor white, working class poor black, as reflected in the people who turned out to see his funeral train. And it's an appeal that I don't think almost no one in politics today really has or makes an effort at. And what do you think accounted for that?
I mean, I think number one, he really had a basic respect for people. He said in that speech in South Africa in 1966, he said, all people are, every human being is a child of God. And the point of government is to protect them and to increase their freedom. And that's how he went through life. He really believed in the dignity of each and every human being. And I think that really came through. So, whereas a lot of politicians were sort of either on the urban side or the rural side of the divide, and that's still true, very much true today, he saw white American farmers who were really struggling, and he reached out to them, and they felt seen and they felt heard by him. And at the same time, he was working, that community in Indianapolis, they responded to him that night, not because he gave a pretty speech that night, which he did, but because he had been in that community and communities like it again and again and again and again and again. And so they trusted him. They knew he was on their side. And they knew he was going to tell them the truth. And so that came through with people who are struggling across our country. And I think too much today, we're so divided and so angry at anybody who doesn't see the world the way we see it, that it's hard to see the dignity and the struggle and hear the pain that and the fear that people feel who don't agree with us.
I want to ask you about your mother, Ethel Kennedy, who passed away last year at the age of 96. You may not be able to see it, but over my right shoulder is a photograph here in my house of me and President Obama and Pope Francis.
Oh,
September 2015. at the White House. It was the same day I met your mother, Ethel Kennedy. And the thing I remember about the event most is that your mother, more than the president of the United States, more than the Pope, was the top celebrity. Everyone wanted to meet Ethel Kennedy. Uh, she got the biggest applause, but she sounds like she was just an extraordinary person, an extraordinary woman, and an extraordinary mother. Tell us something about her.
She was an extraordinary human being. You know, she started life in extraordinary poverty. And then very early on in her life, her father, who had a sixth grade education, became one of the wealthiest people in the United States. And so she grew up in this kind of extraordinary mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, but as a bit of an outsider. They were Catholic, everybody else was Protestants. They were definitely recently rich, not the generational wealth of others. And so she grew up in this kind of feeling a little bit like an outsider, but in this enclosed, very privileged Greenwich community. And then she met and fell in love with my father, and her world just opened up in every single way. She started campaigning for president, for John Kennedy, who was then running for Congress. And she started going to Italian communities and Black communities and Polish communities and meeting people, you know, working arm to arm with people who are struggling in our country. And she found it so exciting and exhilarating to expand her mind and expand her world. And then she married Daddy, and again, she started traveling with him around the world and seeing how people were living and understanding the struggles of others. And she felt that so viscerally, and they became this incredible team in a way that was extremely unusual in the 1960s. I mean, I think everybody in our country needs to go watch Mad Men, that TV series, because it
Yes.
really shows you what it was like to be a woman or Black or Latino or anybody and white man in the 1960s. And that pair was the opposite of that. They went everywhere together. They worked together. My mother was constantly bringing us to see Daddy in the Justice Department because she wanted us to understand the importance of his work. And he loved to be with his kids. You know, it's all of this. And then she's campaigning with him in 1968. She's got 10 children. She's pregnant. They win California. That means they'll probably win the election. And they're walking through a kitchen, and a guy comes out and shoots 5 people. I mean, my mother was next to, including my father, plus my father, so 6 people altogether. I mean, it's a miracle that she wasn't killed, a miracle. And now she finds herself with 10 children without her partner, pregnant and alone. And you know, how do you get out of bed in the morning?
Right.
How do you grapple with that? Imagine. And she, through her faith, through her love, through her understanding that she had children to raise who needed her, plowed through it. She didn't hide in a hole. She said, I'm going to continue to do this work on social justice that has become so vitally important to me. So she goes out and works with Cesar Chavez, and she goes to Alcatraz when the Indians take it over. And she's, you know, stays with them and works with them and helps them. And she goes to Albania and brings them the first mammogram machines, and she goes to Haiti, and she just goes all over the world all over our country. Whenever she's needed, she shows up and shows up and shows up.
Wow, what a story.
Amazing, just dynamic. And I mean, you saw her kind of energy and joy that I think really drew people to her because there was this kind of inner joy that was so extraordinary.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, Kerry, thank you for continuing your father's legacy and your father's work and dedicating yourself to the Kennedy legacy. As a child of the 60s, I'm 68 years old. The Kennedy family legacy is very much a part of my life and my motivation for public service in my time in Washington. And thank you for your time with us on WBGO.
Always great to be with you, Jay, and I'll see you tonight.
I'll see you tonight at dinner. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.